Good morning. Wow, what a response. Good morning. How is everyone? Get your coffee. Thank you for having us, David and Jennifer, the whole IOP team. This is a great event. We're really all happy to be here. David, Alexa, Ested, thank you for joining me. Boy, there's a lot of ground to cover, and we'll cover it as quickly as we can, as efficiently as we can. I think the three things that I'd like for us to tackle in this time that we've got here are, in this order, institutional bias, individual reticence, as well as industry best practices. And that's a lot. Let me try to break it down as cleanly as I can. You know, last night, former Chairman Priebus made the remark about, Joe Schmo in rural Wisconsin somewhere, that maybe we need to not pay so much attention to him, unless he's a delegate, in which case we should pay lots of attention to him. And I think those of us who have been on the ground doing a lot of reporting in the last, 10 years or so would tell you that the reason that you're paying a lot of attention to Joe Schmo, the voter in rural Wisconsin, is because Joe Schmo, the delegate today, was 10 years ago just Joe Schmo, the guy who might not have even been a voter. He might not have been engaged at all, but something changed, something mobilized him. And figuring out what it was that mobilized him, figuring out what's changed in that person's life, what's changed in his community, is a big key to sort of unlocking what's happening in America right now. So I want to talk about that institutional bias first. We see it from a party chairman talking about Joe Schmo in rural Wisconsin, but we also see it within our industry, right? We see that there is something of an institutional bias against speaking to the man on the street, speaking to the everyman, because let's face it, those aren't always the sexiest stories. The palace intrigue from inside of a campaign and getting the latest gossip about who's up and who's down and tracking some of that can be a lot more fun. It can get a lot more clicks, but it's probably not quite as important. So I want to talk a little bit about that institutional bias. Ested, if I can lob this to you as broadly as I can, why do you think that we need to be paying attention and trying to be as inclusive as possible with our reporting, casting that net, getting down to ground level, and trying to elevate voices that we typically do not see represented in media?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think this panel, I love the topic, I love folks being here. I mean, I think this is really important because the marriage of the two is really important. I'm not someone who thinks that the kind of top-down or palace intrigue approach should be like banished to the earth. I think it just takes up a lot of space. And for me, the best version of political reporting does a little bit of both. Figures out what's happening on the inside, figures out the kind of top-down messages, but also sees how those are playing from the ground up. And I think that's particularly important in this era. I mean, when we think about the ways that political institutions have been upended, particularly since the Trump era, I would posit that the really defining failure of political media in that time was being too disconnected from people on the ground. I think that contributed to a 2016 primary on a GOP side that did not see the rise of Trump coming, on the Democratic side did not see the coreness of economic populism, and certainly on the general election side. I think that there is a lot of kind of forces that are shifting our politics that are not driven by Washington, that are not driven by party leaders, but are really happening to them. And so I find that there is real value in the type of reporting that goes to the ground because you can see things that are kind of outside the electoral scope. You know, the reason to talk to Joe Schmo is not because he's going to predict who's going to win or lose the election. It's because there are themes and kind of issues that you get from talking to people that really show how folks are being animated. And one of the things I try to think about is when comes election day, I don't want the scope of my reporting to just be judged on if I've prepared a reader or a listener at this point to just know who's up or who's down, right? Actually, explicitly in the run-up, the podcast that I do for the Times, last year we talked about we're not even going to deal with that question at all. We're going to deal with the question of how the parties have shifted to bring us to the point where we have election deniers on the ballot, that we have a kind of party that is dealing in asymmetric polarization, one party changing in different type of ways. And I think that really speaks to what a lot of people are feeling right now. When you're only dealing with political realities as they exist, I think sometimes you talk above that Joe Schmo, who really needs a type of reporting that is grounded in their experience. And so I really think the marriage of both of them is where the best version of political journalism lives, where you can say what's happening from party leaders and the decisions they're making, but you're also recognizing the gaps in terms of where their messages aren't landing with people. Because in elections, that's what really matters, right? These are referendums that come from the bottom up. And so if you are an elections reporter, you have to understand that some of your job is understanding ideological shifts in candidates, but some of your job is just vibe checking the country and the folks who are coming to ballot boxes, and that's equally as important.
Wow, there's so much to unpack there, and I hope we can unpack some of it as we go. Alexa, I'm curious, we were just talking about this, the back of the room. Now, you are not a national reporter, unlike the other three of us, so you've surely got a bit of a different perspective on all this, but specific to the work you've done covering demographics. We were just talking about how demographics is not really a quantitative statistical question as much as it is a human being question. So how do you approach that in the work that you do? And maybe contrast that, if you can, implicitly perhaps, with some of the reporting that you see at the national level around those same issues you cover locally.
I think it's similar to that ground-up approach, but I think the focus is slightly different in that it's not so much maybe the individual voter who might be able to speak to some of the issues that matter, but it's the broader community and the needs of those communities, the way that community has changed, the gap between that community and government. And often we think about, in Texas, we don't have a great turnout rate, as some of you may know. In a very, very good year, we'll get 50% voter turnout in a very good year. And I think that we often think of that other half that didn't vote as people who are sort of apathetic to the process, but it's really about where people have been failed by government, where people haven't been served by politics, that they don't have that connection to it. And so when I think about this approach and sort of the difference that I think maybe more local folks often think about is, we think about communities, how they are being served, how they are not being served, and I think that's as crucial to election and campaign reporting than some of the debates and whatnot. If you're covering, for example, the new congressional district that was created in South Texas, down in the valley, to be more competitive for Republicans, that is an area where some of the poorest people in this country live. It's an area with some of the highest uninsured rates in this country. Most of those people are going to be children. If you are covering an election in which healthcare is not being talked about, but that's one of the biggest needs in that community, how do you marry those two things? So that, sure, you have some of the more traditional campaign reporting, but you're also going into the communities and understanding what their needs are, and maybe in some ways how they haven't been served by their government. Why do we expect someone to care about an election for a system that has never served them? And I think that's a lot of what local reporting, at least from my perspective, often is within the sort of campaign and election sphere.
Mm-hmm. David, so I've just asked Ested about the what, and I've asked Alexa about the who. I want you to talk a little bit about the how. You've done a lot of really great work in the past year on the ground in communities that are perhaps not well understood, certainly not well covered. And I'm wondering how you've picked your spots. And Jeff Zeleny made a great point a minute ago about sort of not falling for the self-selection trap of going to Trump rallies, right? Like, don't fish in ponds that have been stocked and overstocked, right? So how do you pick the spots that you want to go to? Perhaps more importantly, how do you decide where you want to, the places you want to not go to? What's your process there? And can you walk us through some of the mechanics of it?
Yeah, I think there's some tension there because you want to be in the bloodstream of the news, right? I'm not doing 6-month long projects or something. These are typically things that try to be in the news and in the moment, and yet I don't want to be where any other reporters are, or at least hopefully where only a few other reporters are. So the Trump rally, and I mean that can mean you could go to the Trump rally, but maybe you're not training your eyes on the screen. I remember a story I really liked, a colleague of mine, Meredith McGraw, wrote, where she learned, I think, a lot more in Arizona at a rally by turning her lens, and I mean her reporting lens, back the other way and looking at the crowd and telling us something new about conspiracy theories in the GOP. I think it was something about Kennedy at that point in the crowd. So I think trying to be close to the news, but not quite where everybody else is helpful in picking a target. And I think what's underlying that question is that really the target is 50% of the battle, right? So, and then there are a bunch of other questions too. Yeah, I like to go, you want to go to Iowa and you want to go to Wisconsin and you want to talk to non-college educated white Republican voters, but then if you're trying to get a real sense of things, you should also probably go to Oakland, California and talk to black Democrats. So at least that's been kind of what's been guiding my thoughts about that.
Yeah, Ested and Alexa, jump in on that if you can, because it does seem like, and we've all sort of rolled our eyes at the caricature of the diner voter somewhere off the interstate down on his luck, right? When in fact, actually, I found some fascinating, diners, Hispanic diners in barrios in South Phoenix, where you can actually learn some amazing things. And so, on the one hand, you have to be cognizant, as David was just saying, of sort of maybe where those traps are. But at the same time, you have to be open and you have to be sort of humble enough to be able to take some risks and do things that may not pan out in search of a great story, in search of great characters. So how do you balance that, Ested?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, I'm someone who doesn't think inherently a diner story is a bad thing. To me, the problem with diner stories is that they're poorly executed. They're letting people live in euphemisms. They're letting people live in generalities, when I feel like the best version of that digs deeper than the kind of levels that we all know. Trump voters specifically live in such a self-selecting media bubble that I often feel like you hear the same type of phrases over and over, ones that we're very familiar with, right? He's a businessman, he speaks like me, things like that. To me, that is a starting point of how I'm talking to that person. I am trying to hear what is it about him that makes you connect, right? I'm trying to hear something more specific that gets deeper there. That's not, to me, like, that can be executed in the diner. It's on me as an onus, as a reporter, to get to something that is unique there. And, I feel like, the lens that we can put on voter stories can certainly be overly anecdotal. I also want to marry what I'm getting from people with data, right? I want to make sure it is on a trend. I want to make sure it fits into a political framing. That's part of the target selection that we're talking about. So I don't really feel it is just an individual character approach. Even for us, as we're doing audio, I think there's a real willingness to listen to people who you would not read, right? I think we can get people, today on our show, we have Mike Lindell and we have Ronna McDaniel. I think that's someone you would not have the willingness to read something to, but you can build a framing in that earns someone to care about them. But at the same time, we don't need to overdo that and lean into the kind of fetishization of these type of folks either. And so it's really important for me, and I think our team, to think about we're still building to a political point that's rooted in numbers, that's rooted in a broader kind of scene of the electorate. And I think that is what, to me, voters really build to. Like, not just an individual, but an individual that's representative of something that still has a larger news value.
And Alexa, inherent in what Ested just said, I think, is an ability in those environments to sort of break down some barriers and to get people to not only get off their talking points, but to trust you to have a conversation, to feel like this is a conversation, in fact, that it is not an interview. I'm wondering, with the work you do, and in particular, I'm really interested because I know that you've spent a lot of time around undocumented populations in Texas. I'm wondering how you try to break down some of those barriers, how you earn individuals' trust so that you can try to tell their story in the most nuanced and three-dimensional way possible that gets beyond some of just the sort of lazy caricaturing that Ested was just talking about.
Yeah, I think sort of practically, part of it is not walking up to someone with your notebook and your pen pulled out, because I think in terms of that sort of like power dynamic and where that interaction is going to begin is not going to begin as a conversation, it's going to begin as an interview, right? Obviously, you want to be clear about when someone's speaking to a reporter and on the record and the implications of that. I do think that when you're talking to communities that have not often been central in the news, there is a little bit of even like reporter education that has to go on, especially with people who may, be in specific legal circumstances, or someone who might be waiting for a visa to come in, right? Like, you have to be a little bit more careful in making sure they understand the stakes of speaking with you. But I think the idea of building trust comes with showing up. And maybe this is like one of those, like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? But like, a lot of the relationships that I've been able to build with folks, even people that I've never even met, but maybe might have heard about the work we did, maybe might have heard about one of the organizations we talked to. And I think a little bit of that is organic. The other part of this, though, is that I don't think the diner stories are necessarily bad either. I think it's that we don't go to enough diners. And, you know, if you are writing about a congressional race and you have not looked up the demographics of that congressional district, if you have not looked up at the electorate and who is normally part of it and who is often not, you're already starting from behind, because you're not actually starting with a clear picture of who the people are that you need to be talking to. You know, luckily for all of us, the Census Bureau already does this. They already break down demographics by congressional district, and I think that should be one of the first things you do before you go into these communities. But the other thing is find the people who have already built these relationships. Find the nonprofit groups that are serving these folks. Find that longtime community organizer that's been trying to get people to sign a petition for getting their streets paved, right? I think we often also think about political and campaign reporting from the race that we're at. But people's engagement with government and the process and with their communities often starts way, way before that. It might start by going to a school board meeting or your community neighborhood association meeting. And those are potential entryways as well, especially to building, you know, a bit more organic and maybe more thoughtful relationships with people that then lead to better conversations and better interviews.
And to be clear, we are in the individual reticence portion of the program right now. I don't want to skip ahead right away to the best practices, but what Alexa just said is so spot on. If you approach someone with your pen out and your notebook, and or even worse, I've seen people just straight up with the recorder, right to the face, like immediately, like that person, even if they talk to you, they're not going to tell you anything useful, right? It's just, it's not a good look. It's not productive. You want to feel that you want them to feel as though you care about who they are as a human being. And in fact, Alexa and I were just talking a bit earlier, one of the worst things you can even do is just get right into the politics, right? A lot of these folks, again, unless you're at a Trump rally, unless you're at a Biden rally, a lot of these folks don't want to talk about politics. They're not processing everything through an explicitly political prism. You can talk to them about a whole lot of things that are happening in their communities and in their lives. And by the way, once you've had that conversation for 10 or 15 minutes, you're going to know their politics anyway, right? So you don't have to ask those explicit questions right off the bat. David, what I'm wondering from you, you know, again, 3 of us up here are with the national media, and when you drop into some of these communities, inevitably, there's going to be a lot of distrust, there's going to be a perception, and that perception is rooted in something real, we all need to acknowledge, a perception of condescension, of looking down your nose at these people, of wanting to come there and caricature them and sort of judge them. How do you tackle that? How do you confront it? Is it head on? Do you come at it a little bit sideways? How do you work with people to make sure that they understand what it is you're there to do?
Yeah, I think it's the same. I just ask for help, and I think that's normally how a source call goes for me. I call into a community and I say, I want to come write a story there. How can you help me? And most people want to help. And it's the same. You know, it's drop-in. It's the same thing that local reporters do too. And I used to do this. Somebody dies and you need to go write the obituary, or somebody's arrested and you need to go talk to the family. People around or close. You're always asking for help and trying to engage in a conversation. I've found that once you talk to people, there really does, almost in all cases, people do want to chat. And you know, it's funny what you say about the don't come in with the notebook. Totally agree, and I don't at first. But I'm doing a series of stories for us where one of the texts of it, I guess, is that I'm also taking the photos, which has been a revealing experience for me. I thought it would be very uncomfortable, but it turns out some of those are portraits that we have a very good photo editor, the portraits the photo editor wants, and that means getting the iPhone sometimes very, very close in front of their face. So after I've talked to somebody for half an hour, I might say, hey, one of the weird things we're doing with this series is I'd like to take your photograph. And you'd be surprised at how willing people are to engage if you're just being, you know, good faith. And what I tell them is, I'm going to take 300 frames because I am not a good photographer, but our photo editor is fantastic. And so if I take 300, you'll end up, you know, you'll be fairly represented in this photograph. And I find people are willing, if you're just honest about what your objectives are, what kind of story you're trying to write, you can tell them. You may not be happy with how the story comes out, but the reason that you're spending so much time with this one person is because no matter what the overall frame of the story is, they will feel that they are fairly represented in that story. Then I find generally a lot of cooperation with that approach. So that's my thoughts, with regret for not being asked the diner question.
You know, boy, that last point about the representation is so important. And now we are moving into the best practices segment here. You know, Ested, I think one of the challenges here is to convey to people effectively that if they have not seen themselves, if they have not heard their voices represented in media, that we are genuinely there to change that we want to help people, no matter where they are. And this is not just, again, dealing with some monolith voter, monolith group of voters that you may be thinking of in your mind. This is you know, across the spectrum, with folks who feel like, from the far left to the far right, feel like the media has ignored them and marginalized them and given them a bad rep. So I'm curious, from your perspective, Ested, one of the real treats for me in 2020 was reading some of the reporting you did in environments that could be, I think, fairly characterized as somewhat hostile. And yet you were able to break some of these barriers down. You were able to get people to talk to you very candidly, and it made for excellent copy. Not only to make for excellent copy, it just at an analytical level, understanding the electorate, it was just hugely beneficial for a lot of political practitioners. So how were you able to do that at sort of a tactical level?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that the first thing is in that choosing of targets. You know, one of the stories that comes to mind when you mentioned that is this event I went to called Trumpstock. It was a Woodstock for Trump fans in northern Arizona. It had an explicit white nationalist bend. There were pretty, open white nationalist speakers. Paul Gosar was there. There were some other folks there. And I actually found that event by, at the beginning of the 2016 election when Trump won, I joined a bunch of these secret Trump Facebook groups, and I prioritized them on my Facebook news feed. So I really wanted to be engulfed in what it looked like to be a day-to-day Trump supporter. And it was actually really helpful reporting-wise. I mean, I would know where the kind of Trump tweet was going 2 weeks later. I would know kind of where Fox News was going because you could see the arc of conservative media that was building to that front. And you also learn a language that is actually really important to be able to talk to people with. It is not a language where I have to agree with something or things like that, but when they're saying, something that was on Gateway Pundit, or they're saying something that is deep in that kind of Trump media ecosystem, that's not something I've seen for the first time, and that is a level of building trust, and that's a level of building understanding with those people. But when I got to that place at Trumpstock, my first move, and this is definitely informed by I'm black, I'm not going to be I'm not about to sneak up on anybody, right? My goal here is not to surprise you, okay? So I'm wearing my badge openly. I am going to the organizer directly, and I am telling them what I am here to do. And I am winning them over first as my initial thing, because I'm not trying to sneak around, That's bad for them, and it's bad for me. And that really informed a lot of the ways that I was coming to some of this stuff. But I also think that it wasn't just, I didn't learn that from Trump voters. I learned that from being at the Globe and reporting on crime and going to black communities that were correct that we had only showed up at certain times, that were right that we were only coming when and not seeing the scope of those communities. And so I don't really feel the need to try to talk someone out of their media skepticism. I pretty much agree.
Embrace it.
Yeah, I retweet. I do think we have fallen short. And so what I'm here to do is tell you that this is not that. And that I want to be a part of that course correction, and I should be able to have the language that you trust me because of that, because I've already, because I'm proving it in the moment, right? Because I know your concerns, I'm hearing them out, and I am creating a space that makes you feel trusting of that, and I'm following up. I'm giving you my email. I'm telling you which portion of this I most want. And even when it's I did a story in St. Cloud, Minnesota, about these folks who wanted to kick Somali immigrants out of their town. And it was rough. And I called the mayor before, and I was like, I think this is going to be a thing, And I don't want things to be a surprise. I want you to know. I want you to feel trusting. And that does not mean I am shirking away, though, from the clarity of what I'm here to do. And I find that when you do that in a forthright and direct manner, in a manner that really understands where people are coming from and are actively listening, I have found people to be open to that. And I honestly feel like they can be open to me as a New York Times representative, as a black person, as a whatever. They can be open to all of y'all too. I think you have to come in a way though that creates that willingness, and that's on you, in my opinion.
Amen and amen. I mean, and just to echo that point that Estad made, I think one of the most effective things we can all do, and I say this to J School students whenever I get the opportunity, it's so simple, right? Is if somebody brings that point to you about feeling marginalized or feeling ignored by the media, whatever it is, that their grievances with the media, hear it, right? Hear it and listen to them and embrace it, and then say to them, listen, I understand what you're saying and I'm sympathetic to it. You need to understand that the only way for this to change is for you to talk with me, because if you won't talk to me, then how would your voice ever be represented? Right? We have to change this together. And to David's point about the photograph, like if they might say, oh yeah, but I don't want my last name, or I don't want my photo taken, you say, but listen, here's the thing. Fake news, right? Anonymous sourcing, you don't trust us. Help me combat that trust, right? The only way people will know that you're a real human being that I'm talking to is if you're gonna give me your last name. And you should probably let me take your photo too, just in case, right? You work with them through that lens of their own skepticism, their own bias. You'll be shocked at the results you get. Alexa, sorry.
I always say like, I don't think you'll print this. And I'm like, try me.
Try me. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly. Alexa, you made a great point earlier. You said that maybe we're not going to enough diners. And it seems to me that, that's right. And maybe we're not going to the right diners. You have to cover a state that is basically the size of many countries, right? And I'm wondering, when you're looking at certain parts of the state, I'm sure that some of the work you're doing is getting down to like precinct level and trying to figure out where those targets are. So again, in the vein of best practices here, I'm wondering, for some of the work you've done around demographic change and trying to understand how communities, individual communities, are shaping the future of this country, how you pick those spots and how you find the right diner, if you will.
I think some of it is a little bit more abstract, and I think about it almost as, what are the stakes for this place? What are the stakes for the people living here? And some of that is through actual data about the socioeconomic situation in that community, the lack of insurance, that sort of component of it. The other part is, I did a story and it ended up being a pandemic story, but we actually meant to report it. We went out there before the start of the pandemic, and it was up in Moore County, which is, up in the Panhandle. You're closer to Oklahoma than you are to most of Texas. And it's this place that is rural in all the ways you imagine a rural Panhandle county to be. They are running cattle. There's huge meat packing plant that runs most of the economy in this place. And we started looking at the demographics of those counties after the election, because all of these counties were deep, deep red counties. But if you looked at the population, more than 50% of the people who lived in that county were actually Latinos. They were Hispanic. If you looked at the workforce, it was mostly a workforce of immigrants and refugees, people from, refugees from all areas. When we used to take in refugees, you had like these really, really diverse populations. And those folks were not part of the decision-making process whatsoever. Unfortunately, once the pandemic started, these were also the folks who were the first affected, and there was an initial breakout at the meatpacking plant they were at, and they didn't have the information they needed to even protect through that. But I think it's relying on data. I know it sounds like a really sort of dry thing, but if you can think about it beyond just who lives here and more about the dynamics of what it means to live here and what's at stake when you live in this community and the things that you don't have access to, that can be really instructive, I think. But at its heart, it's thinking about not the politics, not the arguments, not the TV ads, but what's at stake for people. And when you can approach a conversation like that with someone, I just think it's a different starting point when you are talking about what matters to them, not what political consultants think should matter to them.
I mean, two recurring themes here in this conversation that you're picking up time and time again are empathy and humility, right? And those should be two characteristics of any great reporter. Curiosity, perhaps you add to that list. David, I'm just wondering, as you think about the next news cycle, you started by saying earlier that you're trying to sort of tie a lot of your reporting into the news. And we heard earlier in John's conversation, a really smart point about not fighting the last war and not allowing what had happened in previous elections to inform how we cover the next election. So I'm wondering how you straddle that, how you sort of negotiate that in your own reporting and in your own sort of reporting targets, thinking about what is in the news and what readers need to know about what's happening now, with seeing around the corner and trying to get ahead of that next news cycle and make sure that, to Ested's point, that if somebody's reading you, then when that news comes along, they're not surprised. They already know because of some of the reporting you've done. So that's a tough thing to do, and it's a hard question to answer, but how do you try to balance that?
Yeah, and I don't think that, I don't want to pretend that we're successful at this all the time either, because this is really hard. And so an example, I guess, the California Senate race, I did a story in California recently, and this wouldn't have been the start of the thing, but everybody was fighting out there, the Democrats, about who was the real progressive. Was it Adam Schiff or Katie Porter or Barbara Lee? But by talking to people who are progressives in California, they had this entire other story going on in their head, which was, we think maybe the term progressive doesn't mean as much as it used to anymore, or something's changed around that term. And so I think that's not earth-shattering. That's not we're not going to drop that as a scoop on a Thursday or something. But I do think if you can talk to people, you can start to see some trends around that do help to inform the election. So does that make a difference in the general election as to who's elected? I'm not sure yet, right? So I don't know what the end result of that ends up being, but I do think it helps people think maybe a little bit more be more reflective about that. I guess that's what I'd say. I do want to, can I just add on this idea that we should be humble? And I do want to say I do push back sometimes when people have media complaints. I agree with them about some of the broader issues going on, but it always struck me when I was starting as a reporter. I was 22 years old, sitting at a very small newspaper, and people would call, and they'd say, the media, this and that. And I know it was a different time, but I would say, my name's Dave. I'm 22. I just moved here from Minnesota. We live up on Pershing or wherever our house was. Like, for your purposes today, I am the media. We don't have a conversation with anybody telling me what to do. And I still use that today. I say, I have complaints about the media too, and I think Ested, you said something similar to this, that like, I'm your person right now, right? I am I am engaging with you. I am the media. And I think trying to personalize that for people is so important. I don't think I very well answered your question, Tim, and then I veered, but I'll hand it back to you.
I think you did, actually. We're going to go to Q&A in just a minute here. I just want to sort of close with a quick lightning round, because I love to, just as a practitioner, I love to pick the brains of good reporters about these things. I'm wondering if there's a sort of hard-won lesson that you guys could share in closing here, like 30 seconds or less, while I give you a moment to think. I'll tell you mine. Assumptions are killers in this business, right? And I remember some years ago being invited to, I live outside of Detroit, I was invited by a local black elected official to a black barbecue with local Democrats in Detroit. And I had a completely well-conceived notion going into this barbecue of what I was going to find and why I was invited and everything else. And it wound up being completely backwards. And the story that I wound up coming out with it could not have been more fundamentally different than the story that I was conceiving of in my mind going in. And so it just reminded me, talk about humility, right? But also never assume, right? Like always be open to the possibility that you're going to discover something that you didn't know or that you weren't expecting to find. Instead, help bring us home on this. Is there any hard-won lesson that you've emerged with in recent years?
I would say actively listen, actively follow your reporting. And I think that's the same as lack of assumptions, but I mean, when something is shifting the way you came in here, be open to responding to that and letting that guide where you go. And I think that even if it's outside of the zeitgeist, because the zeitgeist has been consistently wrong. And so you should trust, if you're doing the work well, that where you're going can also be valuable.
Alexa, what about you?
I would say people notice when you keep showing up, and that opens the door to a whole lot of reporting, whether it's the city council person, whether it's the longtime organizer, whether it's the person who has just sort of started figuring out how they can help their community. People notice when you keep showing up, and I think there's an importance to that we don't often talk about enough, especially within campaign and election reporting.
Dave, what about you?
I'm going to say the same. I mean, I just agree. It's the old advice anybody gave you, which is sit on the curb, right? You go to the victim's family, and you need to show that you really care. So when they don't answer the door, you sit on the curb, and I still do it today.
We're going to open it up to questions, and I know we've got a couple of microphones scattered around the room. If nobody has a question, then we can start telling jokes, and that's not going to go real well. So, yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Zaria Oates. I'm with ABC 24 in Memphis. I know you mentioned that low voter turnout is a big deal in Texas, and my family lives there. Low voter turnout is insane in Memphis, and when there is a high voter turnout, it's the people we've talked to all year who have been at every single event and are really outspoken. I know you said diners, but when we're on a 90-second turnaround time for TV news, how are we finding these people without, sitting around at a diner or a Walmart that we don't really know that people care. A lot of people just don't care in Memphis about any kind of politics.
Well, that's the story then, right? Like, you don't have to invent people who care. Write about why they don't. I mean, or do the story about why they don't. Like, do the story about the disconnect.
Yeah, I think covering the reason why people don't vote is just as instructive than covering the people who do vote. Maybe that's not as useful for a 90-second turnaround you have to do, but maybe a bit more practical approach or answer to your question would be, if you can't find, because of such a high level of unengagement or lack of turnout, if you can't as easily have access to people who are voting, who are the people who are embedded in those communities that can maybe speak for them and provide a sense for why that person might not be showing up or what issues actually matter to that person. I don't know, I don't think this is the unique thing to Texas at all, where there are people who are, every single person on a block knows that person because they help everyone else out on that block, right? It's the person you call when your roof suddenly collapses and you don't have money to pay for it, and someone organizes a neighborhood fundraiser to help you pay for that. How do you embed in a community enough to where you have access to those people and you create trust with those folks so that you can reach out to them when you're sort of trying to capture those folks in an area where maybe people aren't as engaged or aren't turning out at the same level as other places? I hope that's helpful.
It was. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Kelsey Landis. I'm a local government reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. I find it's very easy after writing a story about individuals and through a political lens to just sort of move on to your next assignment and forget all about it. And I wondered if you all have any suggestions for best practices as far as following up with people for their, maybe you interviewed a couple of individual sources and used them in your story. Do you follow up with them? Do you ask them, did I portray you accurately? What could I have done better? Do you all have any tips? Do you do that at all as far as gathering feedback and reaction from the people we're covering?
Yeah, sure. I would say quickly that I just, as a practice, I give every single person I ever meet my card with my email. Now, I strategically some years ago took my cell phone number off my card because I don't want to give everybody my cell phone number, but I do give them my email and I ask for theirs, and I will try to email every single person I ever quote in a story. To Ested's point, I don't want them to find out about it from like their buddy, right? Like, no, hey, you were quoted in the Atlantic. Hey, you should know about this. No. Email them yourself, and then if they're angry or if they're upset or if they just want to keep talking with you, then keep talking with them, right? Build out this community. I did a lot of the reporting back in 2020 that David was talking about earlier, sort of dropping in and writing these sort of postcards around the country, and I built out a database that I have of about 500 or 600 voters with their contact, with their photos, and a lot of those people will still from time to time just send me a random email telling me something interesting happening in their community. It's incredibly valuable. It's just like sort of my own little focus group. So I think that cultivating that network and nurturing those relationships is hugely important.
So I would just add, sometimes a conversation ahead of time is the one that helps. So sometimes the night before publication, I'll call back some people who I think will be upset and we'll have a fight. And I would rather have a disagreement and come to some resolution before something goes to publication than after. And it doesn't mean I pull back words, it doesn't mean we change what's printed, but at least it's the same with the idea of being upfront so people know what's coming and why. And the other thing I would say is if you promise somebody you'll text them or email them the story, I do this all the time, and sometimes I forget. It's bad to forget. Keep your word, right?
Yeah, I was going to say, don't underestimate the value of getting on a texting basis with people you are connecting with out in these communities so that you can say, hey, the story published, thanks so much for talking to me and offering me your perspective. Please don't hesitate to reach out if there's anything else important going on that I should be aware of that you want to send my way. I think people like to be listened to, and that's more than just the interview that you're doing with them. So texting with people, especially at the very community level, grassroots level, I think is really valuable, even if you never text with that person again.
Let's go back to this mic over here.
Hi, I'm Kendall Ross with ABC News. I believe it was Ested, who mentioned, the mission of getting beyond the caricature and, doing these deeper dives. And you all discussed the value, importance of having an approach with humility and honesty. Do you have any advice on how to navigate these conversations once they're happening? A conversation with the white nationalists, for example. How do you, go about the conversation once you're in it?
I mean, how I go about all of them. My goal there is to get clarity, to get transparency, to get to kind of the meat of it. And if, however icky that meat is, I don't care. As long as it's honest and as long as it's clear. And so people have said some wild stuff, right? But that to me is my purpose for being there. And so I'm not caught up in who I am individually. Even though it sometimes comes up, particularly identity driven, right? But I'm saying I'm always trying to deflect that. I'm always trying to get back to you as a vessel for what you believe in. And I really have taken myself largely out of that equation. I'm not there to be the smartest person in that convo. I'm there to get I'm here to do my job. And so for me, I think that there is usually an escalate. When I'm talking to folks who are on that side of the spectrum, right? There's usually an escalating intensity, right? At the Trump stock thing, a guy talked about his willingness to commit violence if Trump lost. He actually ended up going to the Capitol, right? But before he got there, he said a lot of incrementally building things. I'm not here I'm not reacting to those.
And he's trying to bait you a little bit, right?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I'm not reacting to those. I'm trying to get to where we're going, and then I'm getting out, right? And so I feel it is really up to me to have a real purpose of why I'm talking to someone, and it's up to me to keep myself kind of clear-eyed on what I'm there to do. And that is 100% emotional labor. That is 100% insert all the terms, macro, micro, all the aggressions. But I don't really care. Right? Because that's not what I'm there to do. And people have multiple sides. I was in Texas after on the day Biden was announced, and this couple, they're quoting the story. They were talking about how they would string up Black Lives Matter protesters if they came to their town. They had an N-word in there that we didn't even use in the piece, right? They also gave me a Christian devotional and made me lemonade, you know? So I'm saying, like, a lot goes down, and people have a lot, are complex. And so it's not as if I'm running from those things, but I'm not only there for those things.
We do a whole panel on all the aggressions, but that's going to wait for the next conference. I think we've got time for one more, so please go ahead.
Good morning. I'm Matt Kelly with Wichita Eagle in Kansas. And there's been some discussion about how it's not so much policy as some of the cultural issues that are really motivating people in this election cycle. I'm curious for your advice is how to minimize harm when covering the way that candidates talk about some of the divisive and dehumanizing ways that candidates talk about transgender people and gender nonconforming people.
Well, I'll kick us off. I think there's a fine line between sort of infantilizing voters and telling them, really what they need to know. And we shouldn't assume too much, as I was saying earlier, in our individual reporting experiences, but also just in terms of what the electorate knows and what it doesn't know, what candidates are saying and what they're not saying, what legislative bodies are doing and what they're not doing and what it means, what the implications are. I think all of that takes a lot of really, really careful, fact-driven reporting. I think that's the best thing we can do for all of our audiences, is make clear that whatever the rhetoric is, and we should report on the rhetoric for sure, but we should talk very concretely, very specifically, and very carefully about what the implications of it are, what's happening to these communities, what's not happening to these communities, where the smoke is and where the fire is. Because some of this is being kicked up. It's a little bit of three-card Monte, right? Like, some of this is a distraction, a strategic distraction that people will use because they're doing other things and they've got an agenda. Other times it is the agenda. You just have to be, I think, careful in sort of not letting them be, pulling rabbits out of, while you're watching the other hand. So that piece of it is really hard and it's tricky. And again, that's probably a much longer conversation to have.
Yeah, I would add that it's a difficult thing. I think if you are the parent of a transgender child in Texas right now who's worried about putting your name in the newspaper because you might be investigated for the gender affirming care you're providing, right? Like, that is a very, very high risk for that person. And I think that the approach has to be, when someone is at risk of harm, whether it's in this situation or another one, I think you have to let people drive the conversation. You have to be mindful. Sure, you want to be able to push an honest conversation, but especially in these situations, I think they get to be the ones in the driving seat. If they want to stop talking at any point, that is okay. They might come back later and say, actually, I want to keep talking about this. They might not. Your story, you might have to push your story because you didn't get to finish that conversation. And I do think that maybe that's easier to do in some newsrooms than others, but it's the part of this that most has to change, because our work depends on people sometimes talking to us on the worst day of their lives, during the worst moments or the hardest moments, and often that relationship has been really transactional. And when you are talking about harm, when you're talking about people who could be potentially harmed by the politics of the day, it's important to sort of challenge if the way we've done this has worked before, if we can create more space for people to be able to be the drivers in conversations, and how do we also interact with them to where we're not just like fishing for quotes and making people relive trauma if that's not actually necessary to capture what's happening. And it's a hard thing. It takes work. It's easier when you've built relationships with folks, for sure. It's not easy, but I do think it's one of the things that we have to sort of begin to challenge, because if we part of inclusive reporting is that you're bringing people into the process who maybe have not been part of the process before, and that is a lot of work for them to have to take on, and we have to be really aware of that in our part of the conversation.
It's an excellent point. We're out of time, but I just want to thank three of you. I've learned a lot. I hope everybody else has as well. And this is a conversation that we all should be having, an ongoing conversation in our newsrooms, in our reporting communities, with our colleagues. So I want to thank you guys really for having it with me.